You're hurt. You're hurt. Who did this?
Men who think the earth forgets.
The storm had swallowed the world. Snow spun in every direction, the air thick with a white that wasn't just cold, it was merciless. The wind screamed down from the northern ridge, bending the black pines until their branches snapped like bone. Somewhere in that frozen chaos, a man trudged forward, head-bowed face, half buried in the fur collar of a weathered coat. Elias Ward had learned long ago that storms had tempers, and this one was mean. His beard was stiff with frost. His breath came in small clouds that vanished before they reached his chest. Every step sank into drifts up to his knees. Every movement felt like dragging a lifetime behind him. The pack on his shoulders was heavy with old guilt and canned food, both of which had kept him alive longer than he wanted to admit. He stopped on a ridge, squinting through the flurry. The land below was a ghost, shades of white and gray layered like smoke. Somewhere out there was supposed to be an old ranger outpost, a place left to rot after the mine shut down years ago. If he could find it before dark, he might live through the night. If not, the mountain would take him like it took everyone who underestimated her. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wind, a cry, faint but human. He froze. The blizzard swallowed most noise, but this was sharp, desperate. A woman's voice carried in fragments through the howl. He turned his head, listening. Again there, down by the river cut. Elias cursed under his breath, scanning the ridge. Logic told him to ignore it. You don't survive long in the north by chasing ghosts. But something deep, old, and ugly inside him moved the same instinct that had dragged men out of burning trucks in another life. He couldn't ignore it. Not again. He adjusted his pack, pulled his scarf tight, and descended. The river lay half buried beneath sheets of ice, the current murmuring faintly below the surface. Snow gathered in ridges along the banks like frozen waves. Elias fought his way through brush crusted with frost until he saw her, a dark figure half buried in the drift. He ran the last few feet, dropped to his knees. A woman lay on her side, her hair tangled with snow and blood. A gash marked her temple. Her clothes, layered hides patterned with faded native symbols, were torn stiff with ice. One arm was stretched toward the river as if she'd tried to crawl. Hey, don't move, Elias," said his voice raw from cold. He brushed the snow from her face. Her skin was pale but warm enough to be alive. Her lips moved faintly. "The mare," she whispered, breath shallow. He frowned, leaning closer. "What mare?" Her eyes fluttered open, dark, almost black, reflecting the white around them. She ran, the white one, toward the trees. Then her eyes rolled back. Elias pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Pulse faint, but there. He looked around. No footprints except his. No horse. The storm had buried every trace. He pulled off his gloves and checked her shoulder, blood soaked through the fabric near her collarbone. Not fresh. Maybe a day old. If he didn't move her soon, she wouldn't make it. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than her. "You're coming with me." He slung his rifle, dragged his tarp from the pack, and wrapped it around her as best he could. Then he lifted. She was lighter than he expected, all muscle and bone, but the weight of her made his arms shake. He hoisted her onto his shoulder and turned back toward the ridge. The storm didn't ease. It never did. By the time he reached the cabin, night had clawed its way across the sky. The outpost was barely standing, a sagging roof log split by years of freeze, but the chimney was still intact. Elias kicked the door open, stumbled inside, and laid the woman near the hearth. He dropped to one knee, unstrapped his pack, and began the ritual that had kept him alive through too many winters. Flint, kindling, spark. The fire caught with a sigh, spreading gold through the shadows. The warmth crawled across the floorboards, chasing the cold from her face. Elias peeled off his coat, then tore strips from his undershirt to bind her wound. The bleeding had slowed, but infection was another story. He poured a few drops of whiskey over it. She winced, even unconscious. "You'll thank me later," he muttered. Outside, the storm hammered the walls like a living thing. Inside, the fire cracked and whispered, casting the room in flickering amber. Elias sat back against the wall, breathing hard. His fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the sight of blood. Not hers, his own faint scars across his hands, ghosts from wars that refused to stay buried. He glanced at her again. The firelight played across her features, high cheekbones, strong jaw, a face shaped by generations that had known this land before maps were drawn. Around her neck hung a pendant carved from bone, a raven wing spread, a totem. He'd seen symbols like that once, back when the mining company paid him to guard their drills and fences, back when protests had turned to flames, back before everything went wrong. Elias reached out, hesitated. The raven's eyes caught the firelight and seemed to look back at him. Hours passed. The storm never stopped, only changed its rhythm. Sometimes a howl, sometimes a whisper. The woman stirred near dawn, a low sound escaping her lips. Elias leaned forward. Her eyes opened slowly. She stared at the ceiling, confused, then at him, instinct flaring in her gaze like a trapped animal. Where? Her voice was hoarse. Cabin. Found you by the river, Elias said softly. You were bleeding. I patched what I could. She struggled to sit up, then hissed in pain and fell back. Her hand shot to her shoulder. Don't, he said, pressing her gently down. Bullet grazed you, missed the bone. Her eyes darted toward his rifle by the door, then back to his face. Who are you? Name's Elias Ward. He paused, just passing through. She studied him in silence, then asked, Why did you help me? He didn't answer right away. The fire crackled between them. Because last time, he said finally, I didn't. Her brow furrowed. Last time, Elias turned away. Long story. She watched him, then glanced toward the door. The wind howled through the cracks, scattering ash. They're still out there, she said quietly. The ones who shot me. They won't stop. Who? Elias asked. Marshal Reddick's men. Her eyes darkened. They took something from my people. I took it back. She reached into her torn coat, pulling out a small leather pouch tied with sinew. She held it close. Elias could see what was inside, a small carved feather of black stone. That's what they wanted, he asked. She nodded once. It's the memory of the land. My grandfather said the raven remembers everything that's been buried. Her voice trembled but didn't break. Even the names of those who tried to erase it. Elias looked at her for a long time. The name Reddick stirred something in him, a memory half forgotten but sharp at the edges. The mine, the explosion, the lies told to the families. He swallowed. Reddick, he repeated. You sure? She nodded. You know him? He stared into the fire. I used to. For a while neither spoke. The only sound was the wind and the slow pop of wood in the flames. Then she said, You shouldn't stay. If they find this place, they'll kill you too. Elias gave a rough laugh. Let 'em try, she frowned. You talk like a man with nothing left to lose. He looked at her. That's exactly what I am. She studied his face, creased, tired, scarred, and something in her softened. My name's Aiyana, she said quietly. He nodded. Aiyana. All right. The storm began to ease its howl, fading into a low moan. Elias rose, walked to the window. Outside the world had turned silver snow, still falling, but gentler now, as if the mountain itself had exhaled. In the distance, through the haze, something moved. A shape faint but distinct, a horse, white as bone, standing on the ridge. Elias blinked. You said the mare ran off, Aiyana turned sharply. Where he pointed, the figure stood still against the pale horizon. The wind tugged at its mane, making it shimmer like smoke. Then, as if sensing their gaze, it turned and vanished into the trees. Aiyana's eyes glistened. She came back. Elias frowned. That your horse? She's not mine, Aiyana whispered. She belongs to the mountain. They stayed through the day, resting, waiting for the storm to die completely. Elias melted snow for water-cooked beans from a tin. Aiyana cleaned her wound, wincing but steady. When he offered her food, she hesitated, then accepted. They ate in silence. As dusk returned, Elias felt a shift in the air. The calm was too perfect, like the mountain was holding its breath again. He moved to the door, scanning the trees. Tracks, deep fresh, circling the cabin. Visitors, he muttered. Aiyana was already reaching for her pouch, her eyes sharp. Reddick's men. Elias gripped his rifle. Looks like your story just got a sequel. She met his gaze. Then we stand together, Elias Ward. He managed a thin smile. For now, outside, the snow began to fall again. Quiet this time, deliberate, as if the mountain itself was watching. Somewhere beyond the tree line a raven called once sharp and clear before the wind swallowed its echo. By full dark the storm had settled into a steady sift, the kind that erased all edges, and turned the world to breath and hush. The cabin held a shallow bowl of warmth around the hearth, amber light on old timber, a low seam of heat that made the floorboards creak like a sleeping thing. Elias banked the fire so it would glow without shouting its presence. Smoke rose thin, a gray ribbon that the wind tore apart before it could give them away. He'd walked a slow circle outside, with a lantern shaded by his coat just long enough to learn what he needed. The tracks weren't old. 2 men, maybe 3. One, heavier, dragging a boot, as if snow had stolen his foot and left him a stone. They had circled at a distance, then melted back into the trees. Scouts, not fools. They'd be back. Inside, Aiyana sat on a rough plank chair with her bad shoulder near the heat. She'd peeled off the outer hide shirt and folded it, laying it across her lap like a shield. The leather pouch sat near her knee, the thong wrapped twice around her fingers. She was watching the fire the way people watched river light, like it could speak if you learned its tongue. Elias checked the window one more time and slid the makeshift shutter into place. "They'll come when the cold hurts most," he said. "That's when men want things easy. Doors open faster when fingers go numb." A corner of her mouth lifted, then fell. Reddick makes men numb before the snow ever does. He sat across from her, the rifle leaned within a hand's reach against the hearthstones. The raven pendant at her throat blinked darkly every time the fire popped. Her eyes followed the coals. "You know him." "I know what he turns men into," Elias said. He pulled off his gloves, rubbed heat back into the stiff skin. "He buys their pride with wages and takes their names with orders." Aiyana tilted her head. "And you?" He had an answer he used to give to questions like that. Something flat, untroubled, a plank he could lay over the hole in him and keep walking. Tonight, it wouldn't come. The fire softened every lie. He sighed. "I guarded fences for a mine," he inspected. "Kept protesters back. The company said the land was unclaimed. The land said otherwise." Her gaze lifted to his. The weight in it wasn't condemnation, not yet. It was a scale. "The river remembers," she said. "It flows through the ground even when men dam the surface." They let the silence sit between them a while. Snow ticked against the shutters like slow rain. The cabin timbers answered with their own small speech, settling, expanding, breathing. It felt like the room itself had lived through winters hard enough to learn patience. Aiyana unwrapped the pouch with careful fingers and set what lay inside on the table, a black feather carved from stone no bigger than a child's hand. Polished smooth edges, sharp, as if the carver had trapped shadow, and pared it down to a single blade. When she leaned it toward the light, it caught and held a faint glimmer, a thread of silver like frost seam in obsidian. "My grandfather gave it to me," she said. "He said, when you carry a feather, the raven carries you back." "Back where?" Elias asked. "To what you tried to bury." She glanced at him, then back at the feather. "We all bury things. The raven does not blame. It brings them to the surface, so you can choose again." He thought of a blast crater black as a wound of men in dust masks, laughing with their eyes because their mouths were already spoken for. He thought of a woman wailing into her hands in a wind that carried no sound away, the way the earth had shaken under him, the lie of controlled demolition. He swallowed hard. The feather caught the heat and gleamed like a coal that would not go out. "You went to the mine," he said. She nodded. "My uncle said there were maps there, old ones from before the railroad changed its mind, before the company changed the river's path on paper. I found them rolled in oilcloth under a broken desk. But someone heard me. In the rush to flee, I left tracks. They followed. They shot." She touched the bandaged, gingerly face, steady, breath thin. "I ran to the river. There was a mare, white like breath. She stood between me and the men like a cliff. They were afraid of her. I don't know why." Elias pictured the shape on the ridge, the clean outline in a world gone blurred. Horses had sense, men didn't. Some had more. She followed me until I fell, Aiyana said. When the storm rose, she stood to the wind as if giving it her body instead of mine. When I could not rise, she pushed with her muzzle. When I tried again, she went ahead and made a path. Then everything went black. Elias looked toward the shuttered window, as if the white mare might be their hooves planted in the snow like stakes holding the mountain down. If she's still near, she's smarter than we are. Aiyana smiled without teeth. It changed. Her face made it younger. Then something flickered in the corner of the room, a shadow that wasn't theirs. A single tap sounded on the chimney cap metal, knocking ice. They both looked up. Another tap. Not wind. Measured. Elias slid to the door and cracked it 2 finger widths. The cold reached in like a hand. The night beyond was soft with falling flakes. Through that hush, a shape dropped past the roofline and vanished in a spill of black wings. It cut once across the clearing, a stitch of darkness in white, then rose again, and perched invisible against the firs. Raven Aiyana whispered. "Your messenger Elias asked." "My mirror," she said. "He does not belong to us. He visits when he chooses." Elias shut the door gently. "He brought news." "Men," she said. "I can smell the oil from their guns." He could smell it too now that she said it. Oil and cold iron had their own weather. He moved quick and quiet, laying out wire trip lines ankle-high across the approaches, and slinging a string of tin cups along the porch beam where a gloved hand might brush them and sing their foolish little song. He banked the fire lower until the room became half night, and their faces were only ideas of faces. "Sleep," he said, "one of us at a time." "I do not sleep while men circle," she said. "Then close your eyes and listen to the fire breathe," he said. "It's not sleep. It's the next best thing." They parceled the hours like bread. In his watch, the cabin spoke to him of all the years it had kept men alive by being quiet. In hers, the raven's shadow crossed the frost on the window twice without landing. Both times, the hair on the back of her neck rose, as if a hand had brushed it not to warn, but to remind. Sometime deep toward morning, the tin cups trembled against each other with the smallest chime. Elias's hand found the rifle before the sound had finished making itself. Aiyana's fingers closed on the feather until the edge bit her palm. The hurt steadied her. Boots on the porch. Not heavy. Careful. The latch lifted a hair and held. Elias's gaze cut to the pins he'd driven through the hole where a proper lock used to be. The pins held like good decisions. The latch lowered again. A whisper. A gloved knuckle tapped the wood. "Marshall's business," a voice breathed. "Open and show hands." Aiyana shook her head once slow. Elias's voice, when it came, was no louder than the melt of snow. "Your warrant blows away in this weather." Silence. Then a soft snort like a horse relieved at not having to pretend. "Then we burn the questions out of you," the voice said, and retreated. Elias waited for flames. Instead, he caught the cough of a match outside, and the paper-dry sound of someone lighting a cigarette, more for nerves than for heat. The fool exhaled. The smoke smell snuck through the cracks like a spy. Another set of boots moved along the logs, feeling them looking for the easy way in. Elias pictured where he'd come up, if he were a man who didn't like doors. He moved the rifle accordingly. Aiyana closed her eyes. Not to pray the way men did, with words shaped to other men's syllables, but to collect herself. She set the feather back into the pouch and lifted the raven pendant from her skin, letting the cold bite the place it had warmed. She touched 2 fingers to the floor beside her shoe, a small private acknowledgement of what held them up. Then she opened her eyes and nodded. Elias breathed out once slow and squeezed the trigger. The muzzle flash was a brief sun in a winter sky. The man at the window yelped and fell back, his rifle clattering against stone. The tin cups stuttered as the porch rail shook. The second man fired wild in surprise, a bullet slapping a splinter out of the shutter like a woodpecker with anger management trouble. Aiyana rolled to the side, and the splinter fell where her shoulder had been. 2 only, Elias said. Maybe 3. A low whistle answered from the trees, the kind you would mistake for wind, unless you'd learned to fear men more than weather. Elias grimaced. 3, he corrected. 4, Aiyana said, listening to the snow the way some listen to a drum. 1 waits. He has no patience. His breath is loud. They didn't spend the night with the small war that might have been. Men who wanted easy went away to make plans that required less cold. The tracks would tell their story in the morning, no matter how hard the snow tried to cover them. Elias listened until the tree line stopped counting for him, then eased the hammer down. When the quiet came back, it came all at once. It felt borrowed. You said there were maps. Elias said more to keep them in this room, and not the next one, with blood on the floor. At the mine. They showed where the old trail cuts move from the river, Aiyana said. She reached for her folded hide shirt and drew from its inner seam a scrap of torn edge of vellum, hand-marked in red soot and coal pencil. This is all I could keep in my mouth when I ran. He took it and held it close to the fire. The drawing was simple and true, the river's honest path versus the path the company had drawn a detour like a lie. At the corner, someone had sketched a little symbol, a shape like a crow's foot, and a man's hand overlapping. "What's that?" Elias asked. "My grandfather's mark," she said. "He said it means a promise made by flesh and wind. Promise of what that we do not move. Graves for men who do not know the names." Elias stared at the paper until its lines burned into his mind. The raven pendant glinted as Aiyana leaned forward and set her palm on the edge of the map. She didn't push it toward him. She didn't pull it back. She rested there, fingers splayed, as if feeling whether the lines could remember warmth. He nodded. "At first light we go," he said. "Before Reddick's men bring fire." Aiyana's eyes were steady. "We follow the ravine above the old sluice. The snow will hide us. If the mare returns, she'll take the deeper drifts." "Assuming she likes us," Elias said. "She doesn't need to like us," Aiyana said. "She only needs to hate what hunts us." They let the fire down until the coals glowed like the eyes of a patient animal. Elias shouldered the pack and stowed the map inside the oilskin roll he kept for things that could not get wet if you wanted them to keep meaning. He checked the rifle and the old revolver that had once belonged to a man who didn't need it anymore. A rap sounded on the roof, single sharp, not the clumsy knock of a branch. Aiyana's mouth softened. He says, "Now." "Your mirror speaks in good time," Elias said. When they opened the door, dawn had not yet earned its name. The snow had thinned to a whisper, each flake a thought that had changed its mind. The world held the breath just before the first word. The clearing was empty. No men, no horses. The trip lines lay quiet, glistening like spider silk. But in the new skin of snow, two long lines lay side by side, pressed by something that had moved sure and slow in the night. Hoof prints wide and deep led to the gap between the pines. Elias stepped into them and felt the strange satisfaction of his boot fitting where a hoof had made room. Aiyana followed lighter, leaving almost no sign at all. The raven lifted from some invisible perch and crossed ahead of them, a single seam of black in the silver morning. Then was gone, as if he had never been a bird, but only the shape a promise makes when it wants to be seen. They took the ravine shoulders, brushing stone and fir. The light began to rise, not in a rush, but the way forgiveness sometimes does, slow, unsure, taking the shape of whatever it touches. The forest smelled clean and iron cold. Far off something cracked a branch, or a man's idea of a branch. Aiyana's hand went to the pouch, as if to check the feather hadn't flown. Elias glanced back at her and found her looking not at him but beyond him at the line of the ridge. He followed her gaze. Halfway up the slope, just visible between two fallen trunks, stood the white mare. Snow dusted her back like ash mane hanging long as river grass. She watched them without movement. When Aiyana lifted a hand in acknowledgement, no call, no whistle, the mare turned, took 2 steps toward the north, and stopped. "She leads," Aiyana said. "Or she tests," Elias said. "Either way," she said, "we go." They climbed boots and hooves, making a sentence the snow would read later. Behind them, low and far, a horn sounded, the thin metallic blare of a truck in cold air, wrong as a train in a church. Reddick's men had brought their answers. The mare vanished over the lip of the ridge. Elias reached it with his breath burning and his legs full of knives. He pulled himself up and saw what lay beyond. The valley was a white lung. In its center, where the old mine sat like a rib torn out and left a thin pillar of smoke, rose a straight gray mark against the pale sky. Not camp smoke. Diesel. Below the pillar, men were ants, with heat-hauling crates from a shack he remembered, telling himself had been for tools. Tire tracks scarred the snow like handwriting too angry to read. Aiyana stood beside him without sound, the raven feather in the pouch pressed against her ribs, in a reminder that felt like a hand. She took the map from him and spread it on her palm, the corners lifting in the breath of the ridge. The handprint and the crow's foot lay where they lay, a generation ago, where they would lay until the river moved them. Elias slid the rifle strap higher up his shoulder. 3 nights, he said. The words tasted of iron. That's all a man like Reddick needs to erase something. That's all we have to write it back. Aiyana's eyes were not on the mine. They were on the white line where the river lay under ice, and on the bare patch near the bend that the wind had worried clean. On that patch, a shape stood out, 4-toed bird-made, but larger than a common raven should have written. It marked the ice once then, twice then, pointed toward them like a finger. She folded the map. "We're not the first to arrive," she said. Elias followed her meaning. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Then maybe, he said softly, "We're not the only ones willing to remember." Down in the valley an engine coughed. The white mare shook her head and stamped, impatient with men's slow understanding. Aiyana touched her bandage, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward into the tracks that had been left for them. Elias didn't ask the morning for permission. He went. The wind shifted. On its back came a sound like wings in the trees, or paper being torn, or a voice that might have been a bird's if you believed in that sort of mercy. It said nothing a court could enter into record. It was enough. Morning came gray, quiet, and heavy. From the ridge, Elias watched the mineyard below, men, crates, diesel smoke. The air smelled of rust and arrogance. Aiyana stood beside him, her eyes on the river that lay frozen beneath a sheet of white glass. "Down the ridge," she whispered, "before they see." The white mare led the way, stepping soft where the drifts held. They followed, keeping low breath ghosting between them. At the bottom, ice stretched across the gully, humming faintly. Aiyana knelt, pressed her hand to it. "This is where the river refused to turn," she said. Elias saw the curve in the snow where the company had forced the water east. The land had been bent, but not broken. Beneath the ice, the current still moved, dark and patient. "I told myself it was math," Elias murmured. "Numbers don't scream." And now she asked. "Now I hear everything." They crossed on the mare's tracks. The ice groaned but held. On the far side, the old trestle loomed like ribs of a dead beast. Below, men pried crates open. White powder scattered like frost. Then the trucks arrived. Reddick climbed down, coat, perfect eyes, colder than the weather. Aiyana's hand tightened on her pouch. "That's him." Elias nodded. "The man who sold the land twice, once on paper, once with dynamite." "We take the maps," she said. "We take proof," he replied. They waited for noise, then slipped down the slope. The side door of the office shack hung crooked. Elias eased it open. Inside smelled of dust paper and lies. Aiyana went to her knees, searching the floorboards. Elias opened drawers, found manifests dressed as timber orders, weights that made no sense. "Here," Aiyana whispered. She lifted an oilskin roll tied with old wire. Inside, maps, hand-drawn rivers, burial marks, company lines printed over them. At the corner, the crow's foot and open hand. Across one margin, "Do not move stones that speak." Bootsteps crunched outside. They froze. Voices passed the door, 2 men complaining, one kicking the wall for heat. Then silence. When it held, they slipped out again. Snow fell in thin sheets, carrying the sound of engines. They followed the mare upriver. At a willow bend, the snow rose slightly, a soft mound, unnatural. Aiyana brushed it clear. Beneath lay a carved board, half-buried spiral symbol, faint but visible. "A grave," she whispered. "My people's mark." The trucks rumbled closer. Tires cracked branches. Elias stepped onto the ice rifle low. Aiyana stood beside him. The mare behind them was still as stone. Reddick halted, face shadowed under his hat. "You don't belong here, Ward," he called. "Step aside before the ice decides for you." "Your yard ends where the river remembers," Elias said. Aiyana raised one of the maps. "You're standing on graves." Reddick's laugh was thin. "Pretty drawings. My buyer doesn't read myth. He signaled the driver. The truck moved forward. The ice groaned deep. The raven's cry echoed from the ridge, one harsh note. A black line raced across the ice toward the truck. "Stop," Elias shouted. The driver braked too late. Chains bit. The truck sagged half a foot. The willow's roots strained. Reddick's jaw set. "Chain the tree," he ordered. Two men obeyed, looping iron around the trunk. Bark cracked, roots moaned. The mare stamped once, a sound like a bell over water. Aiyana stepped forward and placed her palm on the willow. Her voice was low. "Enough." The air shifted, wind changing sides. The river knocked once beneath them, a hollow heartbeat. The chain slipped loose, slicing bark. The truck lurched, but the ice held. Reddick froze pale now, eyes flicking from the crack to Elias. "You think nature cares about your stories," he spat. Elias didn't move. "Only when we lie to her." They stood in silence, broken only by the river's slow breathing. Reddick stepped back to solid ground, coat flaring. "Fine," he said. "We'll move from the south bank. Enjoy your miracle." He turned and left. Men followed. Engines groaned uphill until only wind remained. Aiyana knelt by the board, brushing snow from its spiral. "They'll be back," she said. Elias nodded. "Then we make sure the world knows before they do." The raven circled once overhead, dropped a feather that landed on the grave. Aiyana picked it up, tucked it beside the black stone in her pouch. "He says the land is ready to speak." Elias looked down. The fracture line in the ice led from the willow's roots out toward the river's center. At its end, a single handprint pressed in snow, fresh, full fingers wide. No tracks around it. He swallowed hard. "Maybe it already has." They turned toward the ridge. Behind them, sunlight touched the board, making the spiral glow like a coal beneath frost. The ice hummed once, not warning, not threat, just witness. Back at the cabin, they worked fast. Elias spread the maps on the table. Aiyana made charcoal rubbings, sealing them in wax paper. He added a note beneath the heading Site C3 Burial Ground. "Do not move stones that speak." "The council?" Elias asked. Aiyana nodded. "Old Crow will listen." By noon they reached the village. Smoke rose from chimneys. The wind smelled of cedar. At the council house, Old Crow waited beneath the eave, wrapped in a blanket patterned like lightning. Aiyana placed the oilskin bundle in his hands. "The river's proof," she said. He unrolled the map slowly, eyes tracing the lines, the marks, the crow's foot. "You've brought trouble," he murmured, "and truth. They come together." Elias stood beside her. "Reddick will return with papers. Then we answer with names," Old Crow said. "Names last longer." He turned toward the gathering crowd and raised his voice, not loud but steady. "Today we go to the river." 2 trucks followed. Men, women, children, faces carved by wind and belonging. They carried no guns, only shovel sticks and the map copies. Elias rode the flatbed, watching the valley unfold white and bright beneath a tired Sunday. When they reached the bend, the grave board waited half-lit. The raven circled once and landed on the willow. Aiyana and Old Crow stepped onto the ice. She laid the map down, aligning paper with spiral. He pressed his palm over both. The trucks of Reddick's men appeared again at the far ridge, dark dots growing larger. Old Crow didn't flinch. "If they come," he said, "the river will speak for itself." The ice gave a low, deep sound like a drum under miles of sleep. Aiyana looked at Elias. "It's begun." He nodded. "Then let it finish." Wind carried the raven's cry across the bend, 3 sharp notes. Snow rose, blinding white. And when it fell again, Reddick's trucks had stopped far up the hill. No one crossed the ice. Only the river moved. The day after the bend, the town grew quiet. Men salted their steps twice. Women shut curtains early. A black feather appeared on the council door, no wind, no prints. Old Crow picked it up. "The river has spoken," he said. "Now men will try to silence it." By noon, Reddick's trucks waited beyond the bridge, engines idling. A telegram came: trespass. Cease and desist. Law dressed as threat. Old Crow turned to Aiyana and Elias. "Take the maps north. If you don't return by dawn, we'll speak your names to the wind." They left at dusk. The white mare waited beyond the last fence, steam rising from her nostrils like smoke. Snow swallowed sound. The world had shrunk to breath and white. In the canyon, the wind hummed between stone walls. A raven cut across the dark sky, dipping low, guiding them to a narrow ledge above the frozen river. They followed Aiyana first, the mare steady behind. Beneath their boots, ice groaned like an old man remembering. They found a grove where the air felt older than the storm. Aiyana knelt, pressing her palm to the soil. "The old ones are here," she whispered. Elias watched her spread one of the grave maps on the ground. Frost drew the lines of her hand as she lifted it, as if the land had signed its name. "You think that'll hold in court?" he asked. "In memory," she said. "Courts forget faster." Then came the sound of chains. Men in the canyon. Headlamps flickered through the trees, Reddick's scouts. Aiyana motioned to climb. They scaled a rock face slick with ice, moving along a ledge until the voices fell beneath them. When they reached the other side, the land opened into a field of snow and low mounds. Aiyana brushed one clear. Underneath, wood carved with a spiral, a grave-like at the bend. "They built over names," she said. The raven perched above them, silent. Then the first shot cracked the air, kicking snow into Aiyana's face. Elias pulled her down behind the mare. "They found us," he said. "No," she answered. "The land found them." The wind shifted. A sound rolled through the ground, deep, resonant, almost human. From the mist near the mounds, a figure took shape, shadow, and braid, and the curve of a raised hand. It stood between them and the gunfire. The men below froze. Their headlamps flickered, then dimmed. No one fired again. "Aiyana," whispered grandmother. The shape turned its face to her, then to the graves, and was gone. Aiyana took the maps, buried them under snow. "If the land remembers," she said, "let it keep the proof." They fled as the storm returned. The mare led her hooves sure on the unseen trail. Behind them, men shouted names, swallowed by the wind. By dawn, the canyon had disappeared under white. They reached the flats' telephone poles, leaning like tired sentries, a road cutting through silence. The mare stopped at the edge. She refused to cross. Aiyana touched her neck. "You've brought us far enough." The horse pressed her muzzle to Aiyana's brow, then turned and vanished into the storm. They walked the last mile to town alone. At the post office, the clerk looked up at their frostbitten faces, then at the oilskin bundle. "Certified?" she asked. "Just sent," Elias said. She unfolded the maps, read nothing aloud, and sealed them into a federal bag. "The truth will move faster than their trucks," she said. When they stepped outside, snow had stopped. A black feather lay on the step. Aiyana held it in her open palm. Elias asked, "Which of us did the raven choose?" She smiled faintly. "Changed isn't the same as lost." They walked toward the motel with the vacancy sign dark boots, leaving twin trails that wind began to erase. Far behind the river spoke again a low, patient note, carrying through the frozen valley. The land, it seemed, had learned to remember. Spring came late that year. The snow lingered like a secret, clinging to fence posts, and river bends refusing to yield until the land itself was ready. The town thawed slower than the fields. Reddick's trucks were gone, but their tracks remained black scars, through white, fading by inches each dawn. Elias stayed in a rented room above the feed store. The oilskin parcel was gone, now mailed north to people who asked questions for a living. Still, he woke each night before dawn, hearing the river hum under the ice. Sometimes he thought it said his name. Sometimes it said nothing at all. Aiyana came once a day with coffee that steamed against the cold. She spoke little. The spaces between words were gentler now, like quiet, was a language they had learned together. The scar at her shoulder had healed to a pale crescent, something that remembered pain but refused to keep it. One morning, she placed a folded newspaper on his table. The headline read, "Federal Investigation Opens into Red Mesa Holdings." Beneath it, a small photograph of the river, bend men in suits, standing awkwardly beside Old Crow, holding hats against the wind. "They listened," Elias said softly. "They had to," Aiyana replied. "The land wouldn't let them sleep." They walked to the river that afternoon. The thaw had begun. The ice cracked in long-sized pieces, drifting like torn paper. The grave board at the bend still stood, half-submerged, spiral catching light.